Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mariela Colon with the Adult Services Department. On behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's virtual program is another in our ongoing series of literary, cultural, and civic programming. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Kathleen Rooney is a founding editor of Rose Meadow Press and a founding member of Poems While You Wait. Her recent books include Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk and The Listening Room, a novel of Georgette and Lulu Magritte. Her World War I novel, Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey, was published by Penguin in August, and her criticism appears in the New York Times, the Poetry Foundation website, the Chicago Tribune, and elsewhere. She lives in Chicago with her husband, the writer Martin C., and teaches at DePaul. She joins us tonight to discuss the history behind her latest work, Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey. Again, we will be monitoring the chat for questions, so feel free to ask a question in YouTube or Facebook. And with that, I'm happy to commence our program, so please join me in welcoming Kathleen Rooney.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to the Chicago Public Library for hosting me, and thanks to everyone who's listening now during the live stream, and then also if you're here later, thanks for checking it out. So the structure of the night will basically be as described. I'll read a tiny bit from my novel, and then I will do a slideshow that will kind of speak to the history behind it, because it's based on a true story. And then I look forward to answering any questions that you might have about any of that. So my latest novel is, as you can see, it's called Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey. And it's kind of got its own little elevator pitch in the title. So it truly is about these figures, Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey, and they were heroes of World War I in October of 1918, so over 100 years ago. And as you can sort of see on the cover, Cher Ami was a pigeon and Major Whittlesey was a soldier. And so the book kind of goes back and forth. The thing that I think is probably the thing most people notice right away is it goes back and forth between those two points of view. So you're hearing half from the pigeon and half from the soldier. And it is a war story, but I think it's also a love story and a story about fame and duty and endurance. So the story does kind of build up to when you see these two figures who've kind of been on their separate journeys intersect in this battle in 1918 that was known as the Pocket. It was along the Meuse Argonne, and Whittlesey and his troop of men who came to be known as the Lost Battalion ended up being the only people that day who advanced all the way to and then through the German lines, which at first seemed like a great success, but then it became clear they were surrounded. They were like in a pocket, hence the name. And then where Cher Ami comes in is, it's kind of a little known fact. I think some people know it, but most people are kind of surprised. Pigeons were actually kind of one of the most reliable methods of communication during World War I. So I don't want to say it was the only form of communication, but they were one of the main forms of communication. And so Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey's lives became intertwined when she flew the message that saved the Lost Battalion from a terrible friendly fire incident where the Americans were shelling their own people, thinking they were shelling the Germans. So we'll get into that more, but I think that's what you need to know now. And just to give you a tiny taste of the back and forth use of the voices, I will read the first couple paragraphs of the Cher Ami chapter and the first couple paragraphs of the Major Whittlesey chapter. And as you'll hear, Cher Ami, as is true, I didn't make this up, she's in the Smithsonian. So when she died, they knew she was so important and what she did was so crucial to the war effort that they had her body taxidermied and they stuffed her and put her in the Smithsonian. So that's where she is. So here we go. Monuments matter most to pigeons and soldiers. I myself have become a monument, a feathered statue inside a glass case. In life, I was both a pigeon and a soldier. In death, I am a piece of mediocre taxidermy collecting dust in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. The museum has closed and everyone has gone home. The last guests took their leave at 5:30 as they do every weekday, and even the janitorial staffers have finished their tasks, miles of floors polished and pine-scented, acres of displays gleaming and silent. A few hours remain before midnight. This is the eve of the 100-year anniversary of what, according to the United States Army, was the most important day of my avian life, October 4th, 1918. I'm not sure I agree. That day was an important one, certainly, but days don't carry the same meaning for pigeons as they do for humans, and my life comprised other days, days that might be equally worth note, if not to the Army, then at least to me and to those I loved. Pigeons can love. Pigeons cannot fight. Yet I was once as well known to the school children and grown-up citizens alike as any human hero of what was then called the Great War. So you get a lot more from Cher Ami there, but I'm going to jump to chapter 2 just so you can hear how Whittlesey's voice kind of chimes in. So this is chapter 2. Monuments matter most to pigeons and soldiers. Some matter more than others. None matter more to me than the Soldiers and Sailors Monument on Riverside Drive on the Upper West Side. It's not a monument for my war, the Great War, the war that has caused me to be known these past 3 years as Go to Hell Whittlesey, heroic commander of the Lost Battalion. Instead, its white marble gleams for the Union Army which won the Civil War almost 60 years ago. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument has a personal significance for me, one that has nothing to do with war. It's where I, fresh from Harvard Law School, naive and lonesome, met the man who would be my entree into the double life I led until I chose to let the war interrupt it. So I'll stop there, but that's just a little example of kind of how the book proceeds. And so now I'll go to my slideshow and talk about some of the influences that are behind it. And so just to sort of, I guess, preface what I'm about to say, I think a question that I get a lot when I'm doing events is, where did you get your idea, or how did you come to write this particular book? And I love that question. I like to ask other writers and artists that question. And so you can see the two figures here, right? There's Cher Ami standing there. You can see she's on the pedestal and she's missing a leg. That's one of the injuries. She got very injured on this last flight that she flew carrying this message to stop the friendly fire incident. And so that's how you see her if you go see her in the Smithsonian. And then there's Charles Whittlesey, and you can see he's decorated. He's kind of in his uniform. You can see he's sort of tall and lanky and bespectacled. So those two obviously are the real life inspirations, but I think a lot of times creativity comes from a combination of things, specifically something that's sort of inherent into the writer, and then something that's external. And I don't love talking about inspiration because it sounds like creativity is not under your control. And so that's not what I mean. But what I do think is it can sometimes take an outside spark to set fire to the kindling of material that's sort of already inside the artist. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, is sort of how I had these things in me that made me inclined to want to write a World War I novel and a novel about a pigeon, but then also how outside things kind of helped me kick that off. So next slide, please. So as you can see, I say, you know, ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with World War I. And I think, you know, the way that I became fascinated is my dad was in the military, and as part of that, he would sometimes teach kind of military history classes. And I would say, you know, he taught all different wars, and I have a memory of him being particularly fond of the Civil War. But for whatever reason, when he was spread out at the kitchen table, you know, doing his lesson planning, I got really fascinated with World War I. And as it says here, I think it's because the scope of it boggled my mind. And so you can see the numbers only do it so much justice, but the casualties were over 40 million, and that was about 20 million deaths and 21 million wounded. And of that, it was about half and half combatants and civilians. And something about the way that trench warfare and total warfare happened just got a hold of me and wouldn't let go. I remember my dad teaching me about the barbed wire and the tanks and the landmines and these charges into no man's land. And it just defied my comprehension that people would willingly do that. So I'll go to the next slide. And so in addition, to my dad having all these books around the house, I, from there, kind of took it upon myself to learn more about World War I. And here are two, kind of like a highbrow and a lowbrow set of influences. Not that, like, I try to think there's no guilty pleasure, there's only pleasure, but one influence was my guilty pleasure of the TV show, The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. I don't know if anybody else was a fan, but I was, kind of a bookish child. And so it was this very well-researched show about, what if Indiana Jones, before the movies we all know, what kind of life did he live? And one of the things he did was he fought in Belgium. And I was young at the time, but to me, it did a really good job depicting in a very non-romantic way how trench warfare happened. And then as I got a little older, the next, sort of picture there is Wilfred Owen, who's one of my favorite and probably one of the most famous poets of World War I. And I think, I am a poet and you can ask me questions about that, but I think something about the fact that World War I was a war where all classes fought it. It wasn't as stratified as it arguably is today, where a lot of people feel compelled to join the military because they are from disadvantaged backgrounds or don't feel like they have other options. It was still an era when big abstractions like glory and honor and duty motivated people. And so you, in addition to kind of working class people or, recently arrived immigrants, you had upper class and middle class and like highly educated people who would participate. And Wilfred Owen was certainly one of them. You had all these, poets in the UK who went to Oxford and Cambridge who memorialized their experiences in literature. My guy Whittlesey, who I'll talk more about, went to Harvard. He was a Wall Street lawyer. So I just thought that was compelling. And we'll go to the next slide. It's not a poetry reading, not that there's anything wrong with that. So I'm not going to read this poem. You can probably like scan it while I'm talking, but this kind of shows my point about how you had all of these people, at least on the Western Front, less so on the Eastern Front, but on the Western Front, who left these very intimate, personal written records of their experiences of the war. And this is my favorite World War I poem, if you're interested, Rain by Edward Thomas. It's a glorious poem. But you can see from his dates, he didn't make it, right? He was killed in the Battle of Arras in 1917. And so I think something about reading these poems, so many of which were written by people who died in combat, stuck with me. So next slide. And then even more personally, my dad, like I said, being in the military, he joined the American Legion. And so this is a picture of the American Legion Post 80 in Downers Grove, Illinois. I went to Downers Grove North, go Trojans. If anybody's, suburban high school person, maybe you're familiar. But I spent, a fair amount of time going in and out of this building for various events and functions because of my dad. And it's named after Alexander Bradley Burns. And, when you go to the Post website, it explains that he was the first of our boys from Downers Grove who kind of made the ultimate sacrifice. He, as you can tell in this photograph, which hangs in the entryway, he was super young, which I think is another reason World War I haunted me, is that so many of the people who died, as is often the case in so many wars, were barely out of high school, were barely college age. They were youths kind of cut down in their prime. And so just walking in and out and seeing that picture of, how he died not much older than I was at the time in 1918, I think really haunted me. So next slide. Shifting gears, right? That's my kind of like why I was into World War I. I also love birds. I think a lot of people love birds. I really love birds, and I particularly love pigeons. And like I said, I grew up in the suburbs, and I am grateful to my parents for affording me all those opportunities that growing up there provided. but I did always love the city. Like we'd go into Chicago for field trips, or we'd go in to see a baseball game, and I loved it. And one of the things that always told me that I was in the city was I would see pigeons. You just didn't see pigeons in the suburbs. And so when I was in the city and seeing pigeons, I knew I was in for a good time. And I also think I have a tendency to kind of root for the underdog or root for the underbird. And the fact that so many people didn't like pigeons or call them rats with wings made me love them all the more. And so this is, of course, the bird lady, right, from Mary Poppins. If you're a Mary Poppins fan, there's this beautiful scene where Mary takes the Banks children into downtown London, and they go by St. Paul's Cathedral, and they encounter this homeless woman who makes her money by selling bags of seed to feed the birds for tuppence a bag. So yeah, that really spoke to me. Next slide. And this is me with some of my pigeon friends. My sister, Beth, is a photographer, and she took some pictures of me hanging out with the pigeons in Daly Plaza. And I just want to point out that I think, you know, if you really look at pigeons, they're so gorgeous. They have such variety in their feathers, and they all have different personalities. And so I just think those are kind of the two things, right? So those are the two things that were sort of inherent in me, waiting for this novel idea to come from somewhere. So next slide. Where it came from is where I teach, DePaul University, so go Blue Demons. And I teach a class there called Drift and Dream, writer is Urban Walker. And some of you, if you've read my other work or just, you know, were listening to my bio, I wrote a book called Lillian, Boxfish Takes a Walk. And it too is historical fiction. It's based on the highest paid female advertising copywriter in America in the 30s. And so that book has a lot of elements of drifting through the city, taking aimless walks. And because of that, I had the opportunity to kind of draw on that expertise and teach a class about walking and sort of the relationship between walking and being creative, walking and reading, walking and writing. And in that class, I had a student, Brian Michich, whose name you can see on screen. And back in the fall of 2013, he turned in a poem that had this almost throwaway line about an old guy sitting on a park bench, surrounded by pigeons. And he said, "This was no Cher Ami story. Look it up." And it was very funny to me because I don't know if there's other teachers on here, you probably do the same thing to your students, right? If they're reading and they come upon an allusion they don't know, you say, "Look it up." And so that's Brian kind of good-naturedly ribbing me about my own rule. And because I would never ask my students to do anything that I wouldn't do, I promptly looked it up. And so I'll go to the next slide. And so when I looked it up, and this is just in the earliest stages, truly in that, you know, sort of fall of 2013, I looked it up and I was shocked to learn about the Lost Battalion, because that was something that I had never heard of before. And as you could kind of tell, I fancy myself, you know, kind of not an expert, but I feel like I know about World War I. And I had never heard of this incident when in October of 1918, like I said, Charles Whittlesey advanced and got stuck in the pocket. And as you can see on the slide, the sort of more to that story, I think when you just say they got stuck, it doesn't capture the horror of what happened. So they had been told that day, because the idea was everyone along the line was going to go forward till the last man dropped. They've been told not to bring anything. So they didn't have any food. They didn't have any water. They didn't have any rain gear or cold weather gear. And so for 4 days going on, you know, however many they didn't know, like they'd been there for 4 days and didn't know if they'd ever get rescued. The friendly fire incident started. And so things just kept going from bad to worse to worse. And so they thought that after all that survival, they were going to die at the hands of their own military. Next slide. And as I mentioned, communications were really unreliable during World War I, but one of the most reliable forms of communication was pigeons. And just to kind of pause there while I've got this really, I think, cool looking slide that kind of shows how it works up. they did have other means of communication. They had radio, but it was only one way. They were really close. They were on the brink of getting radio to be two-way, but they weren't quite there before the war. They had telephones, but the telephones were huge and heavy. And so, both sides, the Germans and, the Americans and the British, were always trying to cut each other's phone lines to disrupt communications. And in fact, Alexander Bradley Burns, the namesake of my dad's Legion post, was killed when he was trying to restring telephone wire. They sent him up to put the wire back in place, and he got killed by shrapnel. And then, of course, they also had runners, just guys who literally ran messages, but they often got killed. And they had guys on motorcycles, same thing. So pigeons, all things considered, in the midst of that chaos, were kind of one of the best options. And I will say that it wasn't easy for the pigeons either. Both sides had sharpshooters, and they would train snipers specifically to shoot pigeons from the sky to interrupt communications. And then the Germans, in kind of an extreme twist, had falcons. They had trained birds and their bird trainers who would, fly up and try to get the pigeons out of the sky. But they did not get Cher Ami, and as you can see, she carried this life-saving message. And this is the full context of the message. I love that Whittlesey ended it with, "For heaven's sake, stop it." There's a little misspelling in parallel, but you can understand he's writing this message under incredible strain. So next slide. So of course, this is all, because Brian told me, look it up. So I'm looking it up. And, once you learn about Major Whittlesey, you can't help but learn about Cher Ami. And so this is her. And so she succeeded. She flew 25 miles in 25 minutes, which I think is just astonishingly fast. And thanks to her, 194 men were saved. And you can tell that's not very many, but without her, odds are good that nobody would have been saved. They all probably would have been killed. And so, as I mentioned, she was injured. You saw in the opening slide that she was missing a leg, but she also got shot through the chest. They shot her through the eye. And normally, they would have just let her die. Like this, I think a lot of people don't realize that there's a huge animal cost to war. And World War I caused the deaths of so many pigeons, so many horses, dogs, mules, just all kinds of animals. And we might never know the total number. So pigeons were almost considered equipment. So normally if a bird came back and was in this bad of shape, they would have chalked it up to, gotta get a new bird. But because they could tell that what she had done was so important, they saved her. Like the Army medics worked on her, and they even made her a tiny wooden leg for when she was convalescing, so that she could land and move around without the one she lost. And so for her heroism, as you can see, she has this huge list of awards, right? She got the Croix de Guerre with Palm Oak Leaf Cluster, because the French and British have this tradition of being more willing to reward animal participants in war, whereas in America less so. And so Pershing himself just made her an unofficial medal because he knew that it was worth honoring her. And also you can kind of see the tide shifting, and this is what else made me want to write a book about it. He realized very savvily what a useful mascot and propaganda piece she could be in the war effort. So next slide. And so she became really, really famous, and so did Charles Whittlesey. And you can see Charles Whittlesey here, similarly getting decorated. He famously didn't surrender, and that's where the sort of Charles Go to Hell Whittlesey moniker that I mentioned came into play. And it was a myth. The thing you need to know about the Lost Battalion is they were part of this much bigger unit called the 77th, and that was mostly comprised of men from New York City. And it was kind of the pride of New York City because it was this representation, if you went in for the patriotic presentation of it, of the best the city had to offer, right? These, officers like Whittlesey who were extremely well educated and had a strong sense of duty, and they were leading these men mostly from the Lower East Side, from immigrant communities, Irish guys, Italian guys, many of whom were just, taught English like as part of their training. And so it was kind of this melting pot myth, this ideal of what America really wanted to be. And so because of that, they got covered in the papers constantly. And because New York was then, and still arguably is today, a big media center, you can imagine just like the intensity of the coverage. And so he never said go to hell. The Germans did send an offer of surrender. They sent a couple of deserters back begging Whittlesey to just give it up. And he says that he just didn't reply. He just crumpled up the note, kept it, said basically like, pull in all the white flags, we're not surrendering. But in the myth of it, because it made a better newspaper story, they said he told them to go to hell. So this was really hard for him because he just wasn't that kind of person. He was extremely quiet, shy, taciturn, reserved. He's kind of the last guy you would picture as a war hero. But nonetheless, as it says, on the slide, he became, once he got home, extremely popular as a speaker. They wanted him to talk at the American Legion, at the Red Cross, at Liberty Loan Drives. And you could sort of see he, like Cher Ami, immediately began getting taken over by the government. Like the government kind of co-opted him as a hero. And because it was a war that didn't have much opportunity for heroes because it was such a mess, both Cher Ami and Major Whittlesey got trotted out all the time. So next slide. So sadly, even though Cher Ami survived, and even though we have kind of the cute detail that she got a wooden leg, and that's very sweet, her injuries were super serious and she didn't live much longer after she returned. And you can see that she died of her wounds in June of 1919, and they had her back in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which until the late 50s was a big pigeon training post. And part of the reason she died of her wounds too is that they handed her around. They took her to schools, they took her to gatherings of wounded veterans and kind of held her up, to the wounded veterans. They sort of showed her as, look at this bird. She was wounded, but she has her prosthetic. She has a good attitude. Why can't you be like this bird and get on with your lives? Which I think, I don't know. I mean, I think even then it would have sounded a little condescending or a little inadequate, but that's what they did. And similarly, they kind of used her to show school kids in a way that war could be cute or sweet. So she was absolutely taken over as this narrative that was present right after World War I ended, that started gradually laying the foundations, among many other factors, for World War II. Next slide. And then Whittlesey didn't die of his physical wounds, but I think most people would agree that he did, in a sense, die of his psychological wounds. And so this is a spoiler slide. If you don't want to know what happened, avert your eyes, don't listen to me, fast forward or mute. But he, it's historical fiction, so this is the ending that happened to him. After these years and years of being kind of paraded out as this speech maker, he could kind of no longer stand it. And I think it's important to know that he tried to give this message of peace. Like, he came back from the war thinking that war was horrible. And so he would show up and give these speeches saying that America should have no ill will toward Germany, that if an American soldier met the Kaiser on the road, he would offer him a cigarette. And people just didn't want to hear it. They were bloodthirsty and they were patriotic, and they wanted, because many of them had lost their husbands and sons and brothers, they wanted to hear that it was glorious and that it was worth it. They didn't want to hear like, now we like the Germans. So he struggled with that. He struggled with feeling like his message wasn't what the government and what the people wanted to hear. And so after going to the interment ceremony of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, right, because that happened, we didn't have a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier until after World War I. Most of his close friends think that's kind of what was the last straw. And so he booked himself a ticket on the SS Toloa, which was a cruise ship bound for Havana. He had no business in Havana, and he jumped, he killed himself. And he left the surrender letter that kind of got him this weird nickname of Go to Hell Whittlesey to his second in command, George McMurtry. So next slide. So as I mentioned, obviously I won't spend a ton of time on this, but this is Cher Ami again, she's in the Smithsonian. This is a picture I took. I started doing research, right away as soon as I could after Wikipedia, in 2014, I went to Washington, D.C. and I visited her in the Smithsonian. And I think one of the things that I discovered, and this kind of leads into, okay, like, here's how I started writing the book and how I knew that I needed to hear from both the pigeon and the soldier. Her name, if you study French, Cher Ami, right, is the masculine version, right? French is a very gendered language. And so they thought she was a male bird. But when they stuffed her, they found that she had been female that whole time. And so I don't know, how much gender matters to pigeons. It doesn't seem to matter to them in the same way, but it really intrigued me that as a fiction writer, I felt like so many of the narratives that we tell ourselves about heroism usually center on the idea of heroism as being a masculine thing or a male attribute. And so the fact that we had this sort of female war hero was really intriguing. But also intriguing was that when they found that out, they didn't even bother to change the plaque. They're just like, good enough, Cher Ami, keep calling her he. So I was fascinated. Next slide. I was also very fascinated by the way that so much of World War I's propaganda, all of the stuff that tried to recruit men on both sides of the pond, played to worries about masculinity and ideas that women were kind of encroaching and that men were going soft. And there was this real fear that because of urbanization, men were no longer like working in factories in the fields, they were doing these office jobs. And so a lot of the posters, as you can see here, really played on this. So this is an enlist poster, on which side are you? And so you kind of see, this more slender, effete, stylish, foppish, maybe even effeminate gentleman on the inside of the window. And then you see all these like big, red-blooded strapping soldiers outside in the sunshine under this huge American flag. And so I thought that was interesting unto itself, but then the more that I got into Whittlesey's story, the more I was convinced that he must have been gay. And of course, in 1917, when he would have been enlisting, it was a much different time and he couldn't have been open about his sexuality in the way that we might expect now. And I can't prove, he never wrote in his diary, like, I am gay. But there was so much material, as you can say here, confirmed bachelor, no woman was involved. And so I depicted him as gay. And I think I did that partly because, for one thing, there's tons of evidence that it was true, but it seemed to have one of these rhymes, like you can't make it up, right? If I were just doing fiction, if it weren't based on real people, it would be like too much. But the fact that there was this strange gender confusion for Cher Ami, and then there was this question of sexuality for Whittlesey, it just made me think they belonged together. So next slide. So my strongest reference in favor of the fact that Whittlesey was almost certainly gay is that in one of his 9 farewell letters or suicide notes that he left in his cabin, the one to his law partner, John Baird Prynne, said, as you can see here, just a note to say goodbye. I'm a misfit by nature and by training. And there's an end of it. And that was absolutely a way at the time to kind of declare oneself to be gay. And so I thought, I'm nearing the end of my slides for now. One of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I had long wanted to write something about World War I, but I didn't know what I had to add to the story. I didn't want to just talk to hear myself talk. I didn't want to say something that hadn't been said. And so I felt like with these 2 figures, with Cher Ami and Charles Whittlesey, I had a point of view and a perspective into the war that I hadn't seen depicted literarily yet, and I wanted to go for it. So next slide. So I just want to kind of, as I wrap up and hopefully we segue to the questions, this is Whittlesey when he was very young. I teach college and my students are mostly, the age that Whittlesey is here. He's probably like, 21, maybe 22 at the oldest. And he wrote in his college yearbook that the purpose of a college education is learning to judge correctly, to think clearly, and to see and to know the truth, and to attain the faculty of pure delight in the beautiful. And I find it hard to read that without crying because I know, and now you know, how his story ends. And I think that's, you know, kind of to end where I begin, that's where my fascination with World War I lies, is that all these beautiful humans and animals got killed, and for what? Nobody really knows. You know, World War I is so mostly forgotten. I mean, maybe people here are fans as well, but I think a lot of people can't even tell you when it happened or what it was about. And so I think I wanted to write an anti-war book, and I think I did, and that's part of the reason. So next slide. So that's what I did. And so, you know, that's my book. It came out last August from Penguin. And so I'm so honored to have had this little chance to tell you a bit about it. And now for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So informative and interesting. And we do have a really good collection of questions. So the first one comes, so why did you decide to start corresponding Cher Ami and Whittlesey chapters with the same sentence?
Great question. So I think really hard about the first sentence of anything that I write, which I think most writers probably do. And I knew I wanted a really strong first sentence. And when I came up with what I thought was going to be the appropriate one, monuments matter most to pigeons and to soldiers, I realized that applied. The reason I liked it as my first sentence is that applied to both of my protagonists equally. And so I thought, what if I did that? And at first, I write very linearly. Some people ask sometimes, did you write like all the Cher Ami and then all the Whittlesey, or did you go back and forth? I went back and forth. I wrote it pretty much as you read it. But I will say that when I first came up with that sentence, I thought, maybe I'll just do it for these first 2 chapters and then I'll drop it. But I liked the effect of it so much that I kept it up throughout. And I think part of it is, I do know that for some readers, the idea of a pigeon narrator makes them roll their eyes or something. But I really wanted to emphasize that just because something has a consciousness that we don't find immediately intelligible doesn't mean that it's not valid or that it doesn't have emotions or concerns or weight. And so I think I wanted to say not that humans and pigeons are the same, but maybe that they're not so different that this couldn't be the case. It's a great question.
Yeah. And that follows up with another question. It's pretty much a writing choice. You decided to anthropomorphize Cher Ami. What was your thought and motivation behind that?
Yeah, my motivation behind emphasizing Cher Ami.
Anthropomorphizing, giving them emotion.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I wanted to kind of give, forgive the pun, I use it every time, a bird's eye view of war. And so I don't think that pigeon consciousness is identical to human consciousness, but this is a book, I knew I was writing this for pigeons, or for people, not pigeons. To my knowledge, pigeons don't, have a literary culture like we do. So I knew I had to find a way to make her intelligible and appealing to the people who were going to consume the art. And so I also didn't want, I think if you read it, she has a strange perspective. She lets me look at war in a way where she's a domestic animal. So she loves humans. She's friends with a lot of humans. They feed her, they care for her. She feels this loyalty to them, but then she gets into the war situation and she's completely baffled. And so I wanted to be able to show that, and anthropomorphization was kind of the way. And I also was conscious that I didn't want to make it too weird by being like, me a pigeon, me no understand war, that would be a lot for a book. So I tried to, give her her own voice, but make her as an equal to any other human protagonist that I would write.
You do it very effectively. We have another question. Can you speak to why you really developed Cher Ami's gender story? Was it to contrast or mirror Whittlesey's gender identity and lack of being out in the story?
Yeah, great question. And so again, that was one of those things, like literally the moment that I was on Cher Ami's Wikipedia page, I just thought that was such an interesting detail, this sort of misgendering that took place. And I don't think it was any kind of sexist conspiracy. I think truly, having done a ton of research on pigeons, it can just sometimes be really hard to tell, unless you actually see one like laying an egg, what gender your pigeon is. But also in my research, and I think this is true across the animal world, animals are gay a lot of the times. And you have this phenomenon among like pigeon fanciers talk about henny cocks and cocky hens. And so you do have birds who will make it even harder to tell what gender they are by kind of doing the gender of the opposite gender, which all of that was just like so interesting to me, mostly because, like I said, my knowledge of World War I, even prior to these two figures, was so much about how much gender hand-wringing there was in the culture at the time, and just how much, honestly, misogyny, you know, how women were seen as weak and less than, and how war was going to be this big chance for like men to be men and like prove their worth. And so I just thought it was perfect that this great hero who ended up in the Smithsonian was a woman. You know, I hesitate to too much apply that to animals, but for the purposes of the story. And then, yes, it kind of rhymed with Whittlesey. And I found, you know, and I found this, unfortunately, in some of the reviews, you know, not published reviews, but, you know, people on Goodreads and stuff. I read my Goodreads reviews. And I'm grateful to anyone who reads me. So I'm not saying everyone has to like me, but it does give me a little bit of a pain when I see people on Goodreads being like, Whittlesey wasn't gay, he couldn't have been gay. Like, there's still, even today, this resistance to the idea of a gay war hero. I think, you know, there's still a lot of people who prefer that it be this extremely hetero pursuit. And I do think that's one of the problems with war. I think it's a very colonialist and empire-driven, patriarchal kind of pursuit. So I was just interested in these two characters within that pursuit who were queer in the literal and in all kinds of figurative senses.
There's more of a writing question on it, but the descriptions of the horror on the front are so vivid. So how do you handle writing of such violence to the point where the audience is immersed but not horrified?
That's a great question. I guess I would say I do want the audience to be horrified, but not so horrified they feel traumatized or quit reading. I think I was really conscious of wanting to, like I said, my goal was above all to write an anti-war book. I hate violence. I think violence is really bad. It's hard to control, even if you think, but this is a good time to use violence. You can't control it. And I think violence is almost always self-destructive in the end. Even if it seems at first like you got what you wanted, I think it's hard to tell how damaging it is even to the people who perpetrate it. And so it was important to me that I depict the violence in what I consider a realistic way. And I think a lot of books about war, and certainly films about war, even ones that think they're anti-war, depict violence in a way that actually makes it look kind of cool, or kind of they aestheticize it or make it seem glorious. And so I was really determined to not do that to my depictions of war. But at the same time, I will say, you know, a lot of times depictions of violence become pornographic, like they can become violence for violence sake, and you just pile it on to see, you know, can I turn people's stomachs? And so I try, I don't know, it depends reader to reader, it's very subjective, but I tried to walk that line between making it really disgusting and sad, but not overdoing it to the point where it felt like I was disrespectful to the people who actually had that happen to them.
It's so sensitive and it's such a line, so.
Yeah.
What does the Smithsonian say about the book? Do you think it might make them change the plaque and identify Cher Ami as a female?
Yeah, so I haven't heard from them. My agent pitched them a couple pieces and they never got back to her. But I don't think that's because they want to like suppress the truth or anything. I think it's just, it's a pandemic and, you know, it's been a lot for people. And, you know, museums are struggling like all of us, but I do hope, you know, I have fantasies that maybe they'll carry it in the gift shop and that maybe it would motivate them to kind of change the plaque. And I think even more than that, one of the things that I wish, and again, I'm not putting a knock on this museum. This museum's great, and museums, I know budgets and everything. But I kind of write about this in the book. When you go see the World War I exhibit, it's so tiny. So it's not just that they've got Cher Ami misgendered, it's that they have almost no explanation at all. It's like you go from Julia Child's kitchen, which is massive. And I love Julia Child, so I don't want to take away her kitchen. And then there's this tiny little section of World War I. And then there's all of World War II. And again, I don't want to take anything from World War II. That was horrific and heinous, and we need to know about it and the Holocaust and all of it. But I just remember, you know, the first time I visited the exhibit in 2014 being like, this is it? Because it doesn't explain it at all. So not only is Cher Ami not properly explained, I just feel like it doesn't even tell you that much about World War I. So I would, if they can, I would love it if they could do a little more with World War I generally.
Okay, I have to keep an eye on next time I'm out there. I don't think I've noticed it because there are very large World War II exhibitions I've seen. There's whole museums dedicated to it. Okay, another question we have, actually, they're sort of related, so I'm gonna put them together. So you have a line in a book that really struck. Are you able to answer it from your perspective as the author? And the line is, can humans ever atone for drooning beast into their own conflicts on such a colossal scale?
Yeah, I'm glad that line resonated. And I think that's a really good question. And sort of there's a reason that it's kind of left as a rhetorical question in the book, because I think there's atonement and then there's forgiveness. And I think that's a big question when it comes to any group that's been wronged by another group. And sort of forgiveness doesn't totally lie in the hands of the perpetrator. It has a lot to do with the hands of the victim. And so, I don't know, I don't want to say no, but I think whatever it might look like is really different than it would look between humans, like from a restorative justice perspective. And because pigeons can't come up to us and be like, it's okay, we accept your apology. But I do think ways that we can atone are just, you know, this is a World War I book. The words climate change don't come up in it at all, but I think it's a very climate change Anthropocene book where it's about not just dragooning animals into war, but like all the things that we, you know, on a species level, whether we like it or not, do to the planet and everyone else who lives on it. So I think ways to atone would be to, you know, take the climate crisis seriously, to maybe stop eating meat, or at least eat less meat if that's too much, and just try to find big ways, not individual ways. I mean, we should all recycle, but we all know that's not enough, but just find ways to not wreck our home and continue to kind of make things worse for everyone.
Oh, absolutely, and I think this book does a lot towards it too. I mean, as far as atonement, we all are discussing a pigeon, Cher Ami, you know, a dusty, what would, yeah, otherwise a dusty exhibition at a museum that people just walk on by. So I think this book does a lot for addressing that question. Okay, so a little lighthearted. We do have, we wanted to ask, what are some of your favorite books on World War I?
Yes, so great question. One, I'll just say, so my two favorites, I think sometimes I get carried away because I did so much research. So I'll give you two. I'll give you one nonfiction and one fiction. And these are like great books. So for the fiction, it's A Long, Long Way by Sebastian Barry. And he's an Irish writer who's written many, many amazing books. And I will say, you know, he blurbed my book, but I'm not just saying this because he blurbed my book. A Long, Long Way is great because it's, it really focuses just on one of these sort of non-Whittlesey types, just like an average Joe, not educated. And it's from Ireland's perspective where, you know, Ireland didn't really have like a dog in that fight, but many Irish people agreed to fight because they thought it would lead eventually to that country's independence because, you know, Ireland was under essentially, you know, English colonial rule. And so they thought it might be a way to kind of free themselves from that. And it's just, the way, you know, to kind of go back to an earlier question, the way he depicts violence was something I took cues from because he makes it so upsetting, but I don't feel like it's ever pornographic. And I feel like it really is a good anti-war book. Like you don't get to the end of it and think, it might have been fun to fight in World War I. There were some good times. It's just, it's so sad. And then the nonfiction book that I cannot recommend highly enough is Paul Fussell. It's Fussell. I'm sure they're fans. The Great War and Modern Memory. And he just does this like slim but exhaustive look at like the cultural ramifications of World War I. It's not a lot of politicians and battles. It's sort of like when the world convulses in just this orgy of violence, what does that do to people? And it's really good. And then for poetry, of course, just all the classics. I can't leave poetry out, I would say. Like I said, I love Edward Thomas. So any of his poetry, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon. I think the poetry of World War I is really arresting. And then also, I guess, okay, I see it. Look at me. I said I was going to give you two.
It happens. It happens. It's totally okay.
I know. One more is Robert Graves, the poet, wrote this really, truly hybrid, strange, like poetic memoir called In Parentheses, and it's really good. So you should check it out.
Great. Okay, so a couple more questions. The story sounds like great material for film. Have you been approached about movie rights to the book?
My agent is trying to get some interest, but we have not been approached by anyone, but she's out there. So if you know anybody who really likes World War I, and my fantasy, like I will say to answer this question, Phoebe Waller-Bridges, who does Fleabag,
yep.
She said in the New York Times book review, like by now it's been like a year and a half, so they have this question that's like, what would you like to see more of in literature? And she was like, it was something like, books narrated from the perspective of small, witty animals. And I was like, oh my God. Like,
that's perfect.
So, my fantasy is to try to get her on board. So if you know a way to get to her, anybody, like, hit me up after, at me.
We have so many Fleabag fans at the library, all those librarians. So. Yes. Okay, one more question. So we have some Poems While You Wait fans online, and we want to hear, could you talk about that and your motivation for creating that book?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just realized I misspoke. I said Robert Graves, but it was David Jones. I apologize. In parentheses is David Jones. So I don't want anybody, like, especially after, to be like, she was wrong. I know I was wrong. Sorry, it's David Jones. But Poems While You Wait. Yeah, it was co-founded by my fellow DePaul professor, Eric Plattner, and my good friend and poetic collaborator, Dave Landsberger. And back in 2011, it was fully Dave's idea. He had done something similar kind of on the streets of Miami because he got his poetry degree, his master's down there. And so he kind of started getting in the habit of doing that sort of street performance. And then when he came up here to Chicago, he's from the Chicago area, we met through the poetry community, and he said, would you want to do that? And I said, that sounds scary. Yes. And just to explain why it's scary, it's like improv poetry, right? We set up our typewriters in a public place and anyone can come up and say, here's $5, write me a poem about pigeons or about World War I. And we have to just write it. And all the proceeds go to Rose-Metal Press. And so yeah, the first time I ever did it was July of 2011. So it's coming on 10 years now. And at that point, it was just me and Dave with a typewriter that he found on a dumpster. And then very quickly, we added Eric Plattner, which is one of the best things we ever could have done because he is an amazing poet. And he also is a self-taught typewriter guru. So our typewriter stable suddenly expanded. He's like the Johnny Appleseed of typewriters. And then there's too many Poems While You Wait poets to name, but we have such a good crew of people in our collective, and they're all volunteer and they're all so good in their own ways. And some of them are professors, some of them are students, some of them work in sales. It's all different types of people. And so I think I don't want to speak for the other poets, but I think it's exciting because writing is so often a solitary pursuit where you're by yourself and you're drafting, and eventually you do something like this. And this is a lovely evening that I've enjoyed spending with you, but a lot of it is alone. Whereas when you're doing Poems While You Wait, at least in person, you're right there and you like give the poem to the person and you see them, and sometimes you make them burst into tears, or sometimes they want to hug you, or they laugh out loud, or they like put it on Instagram. So I think, for a lot of us, not speaking for everyone, certainly for me, that human connection is awesome and I love it. So thanks for that Poems While You Wait question. And we're doing remote Poems While You Wait, during the pandemic. So check us out online. It's not our preferred way, but it's better than nothing. So see you on the internet.
Awesome. So I want to do one more question. So Lillian Boxfish in this book have very strong New York ties. Do you have ideas for a book set in Chicago?
Yes, I do. So I will say my first novel, O Democracy, is all set in Chicago. So if you've got like a Jones for a Chicago story, that's all Chicago. But a new book that I'm working on is about the silent movie star who was, she made Chicago kind of her home. And so it's a very LA book because she was a movie star. So you get a lot of Hollywood, but then the present day is going to be in Chicago. And so I haven't given this to my agent yet, but I hope she likes it. So stay tuned, because there may be more Chicago in my fictional future. We'll see.
That's exciting. Yay, we are going to be on the lookout for it. That sounds so cool. Okay, so that's about all the time we have this evening. Thank you all for watching and your great questions. And I want to mention, you can check out the book for free here at the Chicago Public Library, or visit one of Chicago's many independent bookstores to purchase a copy. Tonight's program will be available on Chicago Public Library's YouTube page. So if you have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, Lillian Boxfish or Cher Ami fans, or any of the other awesome works Kathleen has authored, please invite them to watch it on demand, and please visit the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublic.org. Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. Have a great night and stay well.